From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Clinical Reviews, interviews and ideas about innovations in medicine, science, and clinical practice. Here's your host.
Hello, and welcome to our listeners from around the world. Thank you for tuning in to this JAMA Clinical Reviews podcast. I'm your host today, Dr. Joseph Ross, a deputy editor of JAMA and a professor of medicine and public health at Yale University. I am here today with Dr. Caleb Alexander from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, where he co-leads the Center for Drug Safety and Effectiveness. Caleb is a practicing internist and epidemiologist focused on maximizing the use, safety, and effectiveness of prescription medicines. And this week, we are discussing his article being published in JAMA on the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's regulation of Mifepristone, a medication commonly used in combination with misoprostol for the medical termination of pregnancies through 70 days gestation, otherwise known as abortion. Caleb, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joe. I appreciate it.
Caleb, let's start big picture about your article for our listeners who are less familiar with the FDA and drug regulation. Can you tell us briefly about the agency, how it makes a determination that a product is safe and effective, which in turn lets clinicians prescribe it to their patients?
Well, the FDA serves a vital role in ensuring that prescription drugs that are available on the market are safe and effective. So for a drug to reach market, there are laws and regulations that establish an evidence bar that has to be met. So based on statute, a product has to be deemed as having quote unquote, substantial evidence of safety and effectiveness. So historically, in addition to animal studies or what we call preclinical studies, this has also included randomized controlled trials, historically 2 randomized and well-controlled clinical trials that give patients and clinicians important information and confidence that the product actually works for its intended use, that is, for the use that's designated on the FDA label.
In terms of this determination and how most drugs are typically regulated in the United States, what's different about the way FDA has had to regulate Mifepristone? And maybe as part of that, you could explain to our listeners what is a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, otherwise known as a REMS.
It's a great question, and it's important to recognize that the safety and effectiveness of a drug is not a static feature of that product, that the safety and effectiveness of a drug can vary depending upon the context in which the product is used. And the safety of some drugs in particular can vary markedly based on how the product is being used. In other words, the product may be quite safe for use in one setting or for one disease, and far less safe in another setting or for another disease. And the FDA has a special drug safety approach called risk evaluation and mitigation strategies. I think you referred to these as REMS, that the agency has historically applied to a very small number of products. If you consider all of the drugs that are available on the market in the United States, thousands, the REMS program has been applied to a very small number of products where the agency has a particular concern about maximizing the safe use of the product. And so Mifepristone has been covered under this REMS program for years. But Mifepristone is also unique for a second reason, Joe, which is that its safety and its access has been highly scrutinized as it's been swept up in national debates about abortion access and reproductive rights. So there were really 2 reasons that we wanted to study Mifepristone. The first is that, like other drugs that we've studied, it's covered under this REMS program, this post-approval safety program. But the other reason we wanted to examine Mifepristone is because it's been swept up in national debates, again, about abortion access and reproductive rights.
Approximately when was Mifepristone first approved? And what were the initial safety concerns that regulators were worried about that led them to apply this REMS, and in approximately what year? Has it been there since its approval?
Well, Mifepristone was first approved by the FDA in 2000. And even at that point in time, there had been debates about Mifepristone's use and safety and effectiveness. Mifepristone was adopted into the REMS program beginning in 2011. So prior to that time, there was an older safety program referred to as Subpart H that covered Mifepristone's post-approval safety regulation. But in 2011, the product was transitioned from this older safety program, Subpart H, into the REMS program that's still functioning today.
Okay, we know our federal government loves its acronyms. Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe you could tell our listeners a little bit more about your article. I know that you and your team reviewed and analyzed more than 5,000 pages of FDA documents, including internal memos, correspondence, sponsors' reports by the manufacturers of Mifepristone. How did you obtain this information? Could anyone have read all of these materials? And what exactly were you hoping to learn by pursuing this study?
We wanted to understand how Mifepristone has been regulated. That is, we wanted to understand what sorts of provisions the FDA has instituted to optimize its safe use, what sort of data manufacturers have been asked to provide the FDA to attest to such use, and how the FDA's regulation of the product has changed over time. I should note that this isn't the first study that we've done using the Freedom of Information Act request. I'll mention more about the request in a minute, but let me just say that we previously had used this same sort of approach to examine the post-approval regulation of prescription opioids. And years ago, we performed several different analyses, two in particular that ultimately were published. One focused on extended release, long-acting prescription opioids and the safety program governing that class of prescription medicines. And another focused on transmucosal immediate release fentanyls or TERFs, another subset of all prescription opioids. So to access these documents, we filed what's called a Freedom of Information Act request, or a FOIA. And the Freedom of Information Act is really a critically important act. It's designed to provide the general public with information about how federal agencies are functioning. It's really a vital tool that helps to promote government transparency and accountability. And so we used this mechanism, the FOIA mechanism, to request documents from the Food and Drug Administration. And specifically, we requested the reports that Mifepristone manufacturers were submitting to the FDA. We requested the FDA's responses to these reports so that we could see what the FDA made of the information that manufacturers were submitting. We requested internal FDA correspondence, and we also requested correspondence between FDA and manufacturers. That is, beyond the reports themselves that manufacturers were submitting and the FDA's responses to these reports, there's other correspondence that we were interested in. And we didn't just use these documents, we also supplemented this information with information in the public domain. That is, information that didn't require a FOIA. For example, we used the peer-reviewed literature, we used white papers and policy reports that are publicly available, and we used publicly available materials from the FDA that were already, readily available. Now, to be fair, it took us years and years to obtain these records. So I'm not suggesting that the process is easy. Frankly, it was quite cumbersome and I think much longer than I would have hoped for and more difficult than I would have hoped for. But ultimately, we did get thousands of pages of materials. And to your question, anyone could have obtained these documents through the FOIA Act.
Well, I'm not sure that anyone would have had the verve and persistence to read through all of those pages of documents. But you and your team did. So tell us what you found. It appears, as I read your article, that there were several key moments during which FDA's regulation of Mifepristone changed or could have changed in response to information they were evaluating. Maybe start by telling us a little bit about those key moments.
Well, you're right. And regulation is dynamic. And frankly, risk mitigation is dynamic. And so this doesn't happen at one point in time. And the Mifepristone REMS, just as with other REMS, evolves based on a variety of forces. So we found 5 different moments in the course of Mifepristone's regulation between 2011 and late 2023 that were most noteworthy. I already alluded to the first, which was the conversion from what we call Subpart H to the REMS program in 2011. In 2013, just 2 years later, the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA requested a comprehensive review of the necessity of REMS. In 2015, Mifepristone's manufacturer requested a change to the label, to the drug label for Mifepristone. And so this was accompanied by a revisiting of a number of different REMS elements. In 2020, the pandemic, of course, generated enormous concerns about the safety requirement that had been in place until then for Mifepristone, which was that it had to be dispensed in person. And so the FDA was challenged to try to figure out the best path forward. Was the product safe enough to be dispensed without having this in-person dispensing requirement or not? And then the final key moment took place in 2021, and this was yet another comprehensive assessment of the safety of the REMS program and the safety of the product. This included a scoping review from the literature, as well as a review of safety data that had been collected since the start of the pandemic, and a review of each REMS element that was in place. For example, a requirement for provider certification, that is, that providers be certified prior to being allowed to prescribe the medicine. A patient agreement form, another requirement of the REMS program, and so on. So these 5 moments, I think, provided us an opportunity to understand how carefully and how comprehensively the FDA has evaluated the safety of the product over time and what sort of data they've considered, whether they truly have taken a totality of evidence approach, and what conclusions they've reached and on what basis.
Well, maybe you can talk a little bit about that next for our listeners. As you reviewed all of these documents and the thousands of pages and looked at how FDA modified its decision-making or made its decisions in the face of the various forms of evidence that they were evaluating, did you have a sense of, what were the key principles driving the FDA's decision-making? Or were there just overriding, for lack of a better term, like a theme with which they approached the challenge of making this regulatory decision?
Yeah, well, I already mentioned that the regulation of the product has evolved over time, and I think that these documents provide a really important window through which to understand what is normally a very opaque process for researchers and drug safety experts such as myself that are interested in actually how regulation is taking place. I think the first major theme is that there were very consistent findings on the safety of this product. The FDA has monitored this over years and years and years based on spontaneous adverse event drug reports, based on clinical studies, based on the published literature, and based on information submitted by professional organizations and advocacy groups. And the documents that we reviewed are quite clear regarding repeated regulatory findings that Mifepristone's safety is well characterized, that spontaneous adverse events or that harms from the drug that are serious are rare, and that best practice guidelines suitably minimize major risks. So I think the reviews in particular that we examined where the FDA evaluated all of these different sources of data and clearly reached these conclusions underscore that theme. There are decades of experience with this product, underscoring its safety when it's used as directed. A second theme that was really interesting, and frankly I was pleased to find, was that there was a lack of ideologic bias on the part of the FDA scientists and staff that were involved in these matters. The FDA staff based their recommendations on evidence reviews and didn't make decisions suggesting that they were on one side or another of a larger societal debate governing Mifepristone regulation. For example, in the first half of 2021, the FDA argued for removal of the in-person dispensing requirement. In other words, they argued that they felt that Mifepristone was safe to be dispensed without requiring that it be dispensed in person to a patient. And this was a move that was criticized by abortion opponents as being inappropriate. By contrast, Even during the FDA's most recent comprehensive review that took place in late 2021, the agency endorsed prescriber certification and patient agreement forms. These are components of the REMS that have been criticized by the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, or ACOG, and criticized by other advocacy organizations and patient groups as wholly unnecessary.
What does this mean for abortion care today? You looked back at the past 20 years at how the FDA has regulated this medication. What might we expect will change, particularly given that the current HHS Secretary, RFK Jr., and the Commissioner of the FDA announced back in September that they would be conducting yet another study on the safety of the current REMS for Mifepristone to determine whether modifications are necessary. What might we expect, and how might the current political climate play a role in what happens with this REMS?
Well, listen, Mifepristone is all but certain to remain a flashpoint in reproductive health policy. There's ongoing litigation that continues to generate uncertainty. There was a Supreme Court case, the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, which the Supreme Court dismissed, but it left the door open for future plaintiffs to revisit similar arguments. And some states are actively challenging the FDA's approval of Mifepristone. And all of this takes place in the context of broader campaigns to target abortion providers and target access to reproductive care. I mean, I'll tell you one thing that I hope doesn't happen, which is that I hope that spontaneous adverse event reports aren't misconstrued or misinterpreted, either inadvertently or intentionally, in a way that misrepresents the totality of evidence about this product's safety and effectiveness. For example, one of the interesting documents that we reviewed does identify 14 deaths associated with Mifepristone use. But that very same document, when you start looking at it, includes one death that was a homicide and one that was an opioid overdose. And I think that just as a reminder to people that causation and correlation are different. And I certainly think there's a risk that spontaneous adverse event reporting data, which is just one source of information and really used for signal detection, not hypothesis testing, may be inadvertently or intentionally misconstrued as representing something other than what it actually represents. But Joe, the science is clear. I mean, there may be a political fight here, there may be a political skirmish, but there should not be a scientific one. And I think maintaining integrity of the process will require the FDA remain committed to scientific evidence and to the avoidance of political interference.
Could you talk a little bit about why work like this is so important? The new administration has spoken frequently about the importance of radical transparency. You've already said how challenging it was just to obtain these materials, to do the study, and to review over the past years all the decisions and the evidence that were used to make them. So why is public access to information about agency decisions useful? And what should our clinicians listening to this podcast take away from historical documents like the one you've analyzed?
Actually, I just came from clinic this morning, so I still have my clinician hat on as much as I like to do the research as well. None of the work that we've performed or prior similar work that we and others have performed examining regulatory policy would have been possible without the Freedom of Information Act and without the FDA's disclosure of the sorts of materials that form the brick and mortar of our analysis. The Freedom of Information Act promotes transparency and accountability, and it's in part responsible for the high regard that regulators around the world have historically had for the FDA's work. Of course, the most important factor that's garnered this respect is the fact that the agency has historically let science lead the way, and the FDA has really important continued opportunities to do so by protecting and safeguarding the thousands of scientists and staff, the medical reviewers and the center and office leaders that form the backbone of the agency's activities. So, Our work, our analysis really provides just one small window through which to understand the remarkable system that we have in the United States. I mean, truly, our regulatory system has historically been the envy of many, many countries around the world because of the high quality of the science and the regulatory science that is exercised in the Food and Drug Administration. And it's a system we should be thankful for every time we take a prescription medicine, because it's a system that helps to ensure that the medicines that we have on the market are truly safe and effective.
Caleb, that was terrific. Thank you again to you and your team for producing such an excellent study that offers such important insights into the way the FDA has been operating over the past 2 decades or longer. And thank you for joining this JAMA Clinical Reviews podcast. I'm Dr. Joseph Ross, a deputy editor of JAMA, and I've been speaking today with Dr. Caleb Alexander on the topic of the FDA's regulation of Mifepristone. You can find a link to his article in this episode's description and show notes. This episode was produced by Shelley Steffens at the JAMA Network. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
This content is protected by copyright by the American Medical Association with all rights reserved, including those for text and data mining, AI training, and similar technologies.